And if you want to kick us off, that would be great.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Chris. In our pre-call, we thought we would just start off by doing a very simple definition of terms and a little bit of background about what we're talking about. So we're talking about employer of record, EOR, versus legal entity in country. And the idea is, as you are taking your company into a new unknown location, how do you make that call as to, okay, let's just go down the employer of record route, or we go down the local entity route. So let's just define the terms first. For local entity, we're talking about any type of local entity. And obviously there are big, small, there are a million different ways in a million different countries. We're talking about a local presence of some description, anything from having a fully fledged company all the way down to just being registered as a foreign employer in order to take somebody on board. So we're going to put all of those under one hat today and not go into too much detail. We can always jump off onto a separate call and do more detail around that later. As opposed to employer of record. Employer of record is probably best defined as employment on behalf of somebody else. So we're stepping away from the US concept of co-employment and stepping into a more traditional supply model. So it's bringing in a company to sit between you and the employee and to provide an employment umbrella. And the UK have umbrella companies that do this specifically for contractor personnel. Here we're talking more about long-term, full-time employees, providing an umbrella of familiarity and local services, local insurances, local perks, whatever else may be necessary there. So employer of record is a company that is formed locally in some description and then sells that as a service to a client company. Have I made sense? This is my first big test of today. Hey, awesome. Any questions before I hand back to Chris and we carry on down them?
So that's, no, thanks for the intro, Matt. That's really good. So I think it's probably worth jumping in now. Becky, I know you've got a bit of a story to tell. So maybe you can tell us your story about employer of record, legal entities. I know you're experienced very much in hiring through both models. So would love to get your insights.
Great. Well, thank you. Nice to meet everyone today. Thanks so much for being here. I have been in an environment where we have had legal entities as well as employer of record set up simultaneously. So there's different reasons why we had that. Typically, the legal entity, in our case, this was for my company, not all companies, but was something that was designed to be more permanent, long-term, larger in scale. It's like you're buying a home. You're purchasing and you're moving in and you're going to be there for some period of time. So we had 6 legal entities set up all over the world, and we had about 20 different countries of employer of record. And so what that really centered around was get in quickly, potentially a smaller employee base, but that's not always true. So I'll talk about one specific example, but start up very, very quickly, very easy to establish, hire, and get people going within just a few months. I mean, really, the recruiting process was the only hindrance when setting up an employer of record type situation. So I've worked with multiple employer of records as well. So have experience from that. Different providers offer different services, different levels of service. Certainly cost is a consideration. Sometimes I would say people look at the cost of the employer of record, not just the burden rate of having employees, but there's, the additional cost for the fees. But having a legal entity is not free. So there are costs of having a legal entity, which usually center around compliance. So you have to have an annual audit. You've got to be registered with all the local tax authorities, have some accountant professional filing all of those for you, have a payroll service in said country. And all of those things have, costs as well. So you're not necessarily writing a check every month, but it is a cost. Now, at my we had a situation where we opened an employer of record set up in Mexico and have about 30 employees. So that's, more on the larger size. Now, the benefit of that was we were able to get in very, very quickly. And we were not sure. The reason why we went with employer record is we were not sure if this was part of our long-term strategy or not, just based on a talent pool, employment laws, all kinds of different HR related factors. Now, we've been in Mexico for 2+ years. It's working out pretty good. No situation's perfect, so there's certainly some challenges. However, we're still staying with the employer of record model because it's very, very convenient. Some countries are harder to set up legal entities than others. The burden of proof, the burden that you are actually going to come in and stay varies depending on the country. And then some countries are much easier to do employer of record. So Mexico actually is a country that frowns upon sort of the outsourcing model, which can be what employer of record, those paths can kind of cross and the waters get muddy there. We are not an outsourcer. That's not why we were wanting to do that. So there was a whole process we needed to go through to establish that. But I would definitely say there's pros and cons to both. It just depends on the long-term strategy, the country, the type of employee, and whether you think you're going to be doing business, for a period of time or not, and kind of what that looks like. So there are pros and cons. I'm actually a fan of both and would consider either strategy going forward.
Just a quick question. So I've got a few questions, but one in particular. So I know obviously from working with you, but in Mexico, you've actually got had quite a number of employees through that model. And I know it's more common for people to use employer of record for 1, 2, or 3 hires. So what were the main, you touched on the outsourcing component, but were there any other sort of main factors as to why you kept on that model, whereas others may leave it sooner onto a legal entity model?
We felt like it gave us the flexibility to expand and contract the workforce as the business dictated. When you have permanent employees part of a legal entity, the flexibility is not there. There's certainly a lot more legal hoops to jump through. And Mexico was a big operations center. So what it was operations support, folks who are working tickets, both online chat as well as answering phones. It's not a call center, but something similar. But we could easily add people, and as the business shrunk or grew, it was a lot easier with an employer of record. We had a great partner as well who understood our strategy. I think that's key in the employer of record space. Understand what the strategy is, does it align, and can they meet your business needs? So I've worked with an employer of record who thought they could meet our needs, but ultimately we're not able to. And so it wasn't necessarily legal entity or employer of record setup. It was the actual vendor, the employer of record, that was not able to keep up with our growth, which is unfortunate.
So going back in time, so when you first set up the employer of record model, going way back, what were the sort of main consideration? Because I know now that there's, I don't know the number, but there's a lot of employer of record companies out there now. So what were maybe the top, 3, 4, 5 things that you considered when you were actually selecting your employer of record company?
One, number of countries they were in. So interestingly enough, employer of records are outsourcing their employer of record. So they're not actually a legal entity in that country. They're working with a partner who is a legal entity. So you're, as the customer, you're third removed. You're not second anymore, you're third. So that was really, really important because you're working with your vendor, you're establishing the relationship, you're talking about their needs. You don't even know who is on the ground working with your employees. You have zero access to them. So understanding it, are they truly in the countries that you're interested in growing into? I would say that's like the number one thing, because you need to know who you're working with. We had a situation where we had a visa situation where we wanted to hire top talent, super technical person, and he needed a visa. Well, our employer of record was working with a partner who was not as willing to go down that path. We said, we don't care what the cost is. We will pay for everything. We will pay for all the legal fees. We'll do anything we need to. We just want to hire this person. Well, it wasn't up to our employer record because they're working with a partner. So that was a real problem. So be very skeptical and dig deep into, does the employer record actually have a legal entity in that country? Who are they working with? Because those are also the people who are working with your employees. So they're a representative of you. I always look at the employer record as an extension of me, the culture I'm trying to create, how I want them talking to my employees, how they treat people. You could be doing all this stuff to try to create an amazing employment experience, yet the person who they talk to in payroll is not a very nice person. And so they're kind of really working against what you're trying to create as an HR leader. So understanding that dynamic is in my opinion, number one, because there will be things you have control over and things you don't. And you need to know that, eyes wide open going in. The second thing would be around flexibility and agility. If you wanted to open a new country where they weren't in that country, were they willing to work with you? Speed to onboard. So I've seen that be a challenge where employer records need 60, 90, 120 days to onboard someone. Well, as you know, the talent market's really hot. You work really hard to find a great person. They're not going to wait 120 days to join your company. And so that can be a challenge. So I would say, that would definitely be something around just, are they aligned with what you're trying to do as an HR professional? And how much are they trying to work with you? Certainly cost is always a consideration, but in my mind, if they don't meet some of those initial tiers, then you're not even getting to the cost conversations. And there's lots of different cost models. I would just say, as an HR leader, as you're searching out, do you have flexibility around benefits? Can you add benefits? Can you upgrade something to a platinum tier if you want? Is everything set in stone? Those are the kinds of things that are really going to matter when you're making offers. And typically when you're hiring someone, one person in one country, it's going to be a talented individual, right? And so you're going to want to be able to offer premium packages if you so choose. If not, then it's fine. But I have worked with employer of records that they don't have the option of upgrading or offering or having any kind of flexibility or anything special. And that really ties one hand behind your back as an HR leader when you're trying to secure talent globally. Benefits differ across so many different countries, but regions. And so having an employer of record who really understands that and can meet all of those needs. Because at the end of the day, if a candidate's not accepting an offer, that's a problem because of your package. And that really could be dependent on the employer of record.
Interesting. I mean, one thing I picked up on there, lots of things, but one of the things that you were talking about was cost. In my experience, many companies will focus almost exclusively on cost. How much is that one? How much is this one? And actually don't ask almost any of those questions in some cases. So I think that's really interesting. I did have one more question about legal entity setup, the other route. But before I do, has anyone else got any questions for Becky?
Specifically on with regards to Mexico. So my understanding from our experience with having legal employees employed in that location is part of the mandatory kind of remuneration is sort of a cut of the profits of the business operating in country. Maybe this is more for Matt, but how does that work when obviously you've got an employer of record that will house many, many employees through many, many different businesses? It's just, I've often thought about this, but how does that actually sort of, work practically?
From my experience, because I've had a couple of different employer of records in Mexico, is they create the calculation so it is a small number, and they're all get to about the same number, sort of, no matter what.
Okay.
And so it is a smaller number. We're not talking the employees in Mexico are getting thousands and thousands of dollars more than your global employees. It is typically a small number.
No, I appreciate that, because I know obviously that's one of the factors when we talk to our customers when they're looking to set up specifically Mexico. And you mentioned a lot of those other sort of considerations, the other issue that we found going through the traditional route is the banking arrangements, and getting money in and out of Mexico is a big sort of, and it's not just Mexico, other countries as well. But I was just interested to see how that sort of worked out for you in your experience. So that's good to hear.
It wasn't an issue. Let me just say that was not a barrier, but I'd love to hear what Matt to weigh in on it.
Yeah, the profit share issue, and it's not just Mexico. It's there are a number of Latin American countries that have that or something similar-ish. The way that we set it up when we built out Mexico was just as Becky said. We made sure that the number wasn't going to be too high, but also that it was plausible and, I'm going to say, as compliant as it possibly could be given the circumstances. And really, that we wanted to make sure that we were checking the box, that we were being fair in the sense of why that legislation was written in the first place. And as you go into these different places and you're trying to operate, as you say, a very heterogeneous mix of companies, you want to make sure that the spirit of the law almost comes before the letter of the law. We then built it into the actual employer social security charges, or the employer overcharge, so that the cost was apparent from day one, which is really important. As Becky was touched on this as well, which is make sure that before you go in, what are you building up in the background as a liability if you want to get back out again, etc. So all of these extra charges building up on top and charging month to month, which also then dovetails into the question about which ones look more expensive, etc. But that's a different rabbit hole we can run off down in a minute.
Becky, I just have one more question, and then I know Tash, you've got a situation at the moment that you're kind of looking at, so we'll come on to you in a few minutes. But the other question I had, Becky, was around legal entity setup, which personally I have less experience with. Actually, I've mainly kind of worked, with the employer of record companies. But on the legal entity side, what's been your experience there, and what things have you had to consider for, from that point of view when setting up in a country?
I would say the biggest piece around the legal entity is just all of the compliance related items, of tax authorities, audits, making sure you're in compliance with all of the wage and hour law. So when you have an employer of record, you have an advisor. You can ask questions, they'll tell you, nope, can't do this, can't do that. From as simple as setting up the employment contract, making sure you have a legal contract. You can't take a UK contract and just go across the ocean and apply it somewhere else in Europe. There are all kinds of legal things. So typically you're going to need a lawyer and a tax professional, tax accountant firm on the ground advising you every step of the way. Those do have costs, right? And so certainly it makes sense when you are going to open a larger location, you're going to be there long term, you're going to have all kinds of different roles. You are really looking at the future of the business. That definitely makes sense. We had 6 entities across Europe, Asia, US, and it, they all served their purpose. The benefit of a legal entity is you can literally make all of the choices, within the framework of the law, but around all the kinds of things, people, culture, how you want the look and feel of everything, you do get to decide all of that. So that flexibility might be something that's really important to the business. And so, which may not always be there with the employer record. And we found that to be the case. And you can really be as creative or as simple as you want, within the framework. So I'm a big believer that they both have a real purpose. It really just depends on the strategy.
You guys specifically, have you got anything to add around that particular topic, or indeed anyone else?
There was something huge that Becky said there. In amongst that, wealth of wisdom and experience that you've got there, Becky. But you said, I think you hit the nail right on the head. With a legal entity, when you try and set it up, you don't know what you don't know. And it's ever so hard to get sensible, commercial, viable advice out of a lawyer or an accountant. With all of the respect that I have for both of those trades, they are not there to give you business answers. They are there to give you context and framework. And they're then taking it beyond that into, okay, I've made a decision which actually makes some sense and we can work with. It's a big step, which you need to go for. Tash, they also tend to be risk averse. Yeah, absolutely. And you have to express, just as Becky was saying, your own firm's risk appetite, if nothing else. These things vary, and they vary from country to country. So yeah, Becky, you're right on.
In addition to that, all very good points, but looking at the long-term strategy, the fear of the unknown is huge, right? Because they are, as Matt said, they're going to answer the question you asked, not give you guidance for things to think about going forward. The other thing Becky really touched a point on, and it's a very important thing, and especially from the finance side of things, but is the tax standpoint. It's very, from the long-term strategy, to understand what your business activities are going to be in country, which sometimes aren't known, right? Which makes a great avenue for employer of record that might lead into entity. So like looking at it, understanding what the local culture, if they're going to accept your product, so on and so forth. But it comes down to the business activities, and what that really is revolving around is the generation of revenue. So if you're actually generating revenue in country, you have a taxable presence, therefore you must have a legal entity. And that's something employer of records cannot solve for, right? So it's corporation tax, it's permanent establishment, it's corporation exposure, which doesn't necessarily come out of day one, but from your friends in finance and tax. That's something to really keep a close eye on, because as you start building, and it might be a test of new waters, but all of a sudden the product takes off, it might lead into that requirement of entity. Now, each country has different wonderful laws, as they all do. In some countries, you can register an entity and continue to outsource because it is very convenient. They take care of everything from hire to fire, so you have all that guidance. But in some countries, it's illegal. Once you register an entity, you must directly employ. So every country is so vastly different that it's always good to look at everything that's been touched based on and really roll it all together, because it all comes back to an element of risk, right? You hire a couple salespeople. Well, there might be some, revenue generating, but it's very, very low. So there's very low corporate exposure. So what's your tolerance for risk? Because that entity does come with a very large upfront financial investment, where the employer of record is, you can get feet on the streets very, very quickly. and they're managing and controlling and mitigating that risk for you. So as you're looking at everything, it's important to balance all those and really look at it from a wide lens, which isn't always easy to do. I know from my experience in the employer of record, a lot of it is reactive. All of a sudden, the CEO or head of sales said, "Hey, I sent an offer off to someone in Italy. Send it out for me." I'm like, "Oh, well, we don't have a registered entity. I don't know how to do employment contract. I don't know how to do it." It just spirals. So, that's why there's, as Becky said, there's a space for both, and they're both, depending on the business activities, depending on what's rolling through, depending on what phase of growth or expansion you're in, it really does help dictate. And there's, on this call, but there's very good people out there to help walk through it.
So Kasia, you were asking, is it possible to just set up a payroll and pay taxes without having an EOR?
No, it is possible. You can, because we have done this, and it is possible. You can have
so that's really referred to. Foreign non-resident employer. So there is still a registration, so you still have a presence, and therefore you still must abide by local employment laws, registrations. But
absolutely,
it's a quick way to do it. But
you don't have to have an actual entity or branch in the country. It's just you just need to make sure you pay your taxes and you understand what taxes you need to be paying, and obviously you pay your taxes. And you will also have to follow the local rules of employment. But that's kind of obvious, but you do skip that step of having to establish an entity, which can be good or bad. Like, it depends again on your strategy or plan, but it is a possibility.
Well, and your risk tolerance, right? Are we willing to get it wrong? And what are those implications? In some cases, there's not really, it's very little risk. In some cases, there's a lot of risk. If you really are kind of playing a little more with chance, because a lot of times employers too are relying on the employee not to raise anything to any kind of local authority, which, is not an established best practice. I wouldn't advise that long term, but certainly I've seen situations where there's been very short-term need to make a decision. But what is the more long-term strategy? And do we want to be best practice? Because that's the other thing. Maybe being, middle of the road is good enough, or do we want to be a best practice employer and make sure that we're providing, making available all of the right resources, complying with all the regulations.
And the other thing to take into consideration there, because each country is going to be different, and it goes back to, I think, Becca, you said, it's about the guidance, because in some countries, if you go the foreign non-resident employer route, again, Kasia, to your point, it's still dictated by local law. So making sure you have, if someone goes to termination, let's be honest, that's where things hit the fan. Is you want to exit someone, well, they're going to raise issues because there's severance, there's notice periods, everything that must be followed according to local law. But in some countries as well, a foreign non-resident employer is viewed as a stepping stone to taxable entities. So they might timestamp that of saying you can only have that for 12, 24 months, and it's rolling in. So and then as hard as it is to register in a country, a full entity, not the full foreign employer, it's just as difficult to deregister. So then if you don't have any business activities and you're still paying taxes, that is a cost back to the company. So again, it's just weighing everything and looking long-term versus very near-term.
No, it's about coming with awareness, of course, and understanding what it is that you're doing, because obviously I wouldn't recommend anybody just going there and thinking, oh, well, I think I can just set up payroll here. That's not what I'm saying, but there are countries where it's fine, it's possible, especially if you have, for instance, one team member that you need that has very unique niche skill for your business, specifically when it's non-selling type of skills, and then that's great. You can do that, and you don't necessarily have to go into that specific kind of project of having to set up an entity for that one person. But obviously, yes, you will have to comply with the local laws, local employment, local contract. Even if it's contract between you and that person, US entity, it still has to be aligned with the local requirements. So obviously, yes, that's.
And then in addition to that, operationally, if you don't have that entity, trying to get an office, if you need an office, or trying to get, you know, a phone contract, or trying to get anything like that, that's almost impossible. So you end up putting that responsibility onto that sole employee. So that's the flip side there.
So we have gone around it. I mean, we have somebody who's in Sweden currently, and we have a very good broker that was able to establish benefits for us, even though we don't have an entity there for that one person, which is not actually even that easy even if you have an entity and only one person. So
Indeed.
that's one thing. And we, you know, these days with offices, WeWork or any co-working space is something that you can offer to that person. So these things these days are much easier, I think, than they used to be.
Yeah. Well, we've done it for our customers. You know, we've taken out sort of mobile phone contracts. We've taken out sort of, you know, Sky TV contracts because they don't have that, you know, and then the customer kind of bills, you know, we give the invoice each month. So there are always ways around it, but it's just that extra sort of layer of complexity and administration.
That's great. Thanks for the question, Kasia. It's an interesting one. This actually might be one of the things that we do a separate session on in a little bit more detail as we go into more granularity, because I didn't kind of get around to mentioning or questioning this, but I also know it will vary massively depending on the country you're moving into. I'm not an expert in this field, but I know that risk tolerant, you know, the risk level is going to be hugely different in different countries, even across Europe, let alone, you know, Latin America and other parts of the world. So yeah. Really good stuff. I'm just thinking it might be good to go to talk to you, Tash, about your experience. We've probably got about, I'm just keeping an eye on the time, probably got about 10 minutes to go through your story situation. I know you had a question in the chat about comp and bends, but also Matt's here and Charlie and everyone else, but Matt's here as well and has got, you know, can offer you some possible insights into what to consider when moving, I think, from your operation in Poland to Portugal, I think it was you were looking at. And Matt's also going to share something afterwards, the event, a sheet, which should be interesting for everyone, which I'm sure Matt will talk about. But yeah, would you mind just giving us a bit of an overview as to your current situation and what you're trying to do?
Oh yeah, we have we have a combined mixture of legal entity, and we use employer of record. We've used a couple of different ones, and the current one we're pretty happy with. I think there's a multitude of different reasons. We're a remote first company. We have various businesses in the markets that we serve within Europe. So using employer of record has really helped us to hire people in market to have real expertise on the ground, but also that we acknowledge that there's talent everywhere and great talent everywhere that we can now tap into in that way. I think what we need help with and what we need to get better at is aligning with benefits and total rewards, because there's no real benchmarking that I have come across for very niche, specific sizes of company, the amount of employees that we have in certain locations, the fact that we try to really serve our employees with great benefits and perks, but also to make sure that they're globally consistent where they can be. But then, you know, the statutory benefits in Poland for sick pay, for example, is so vastly different to that in the UK, the US. So we can't align globally on these things. So just any advice from anyone really in the room of benchmarking benefits, benchmarking total rewards, benchmarking comp.
Yeah, so definitely run up across this. And then even when you're, say, for example, benchmarking within Spain, well, Madrid is going to be very, very different than, you know, Seville, right? And so trying to compare those things can be such a challenge. Looking at capital cities and then remote cities in the countryside. So what we would do is, number one, employer records actually have a lot of great resources. So we tap into employer of record where it made sense, where they had information. I certainly did a lot of networking on some of the HR blogs, the HR sites, to try to get information. I signed up for all of the big publications. So like, Deloitte, Towers, Willis, Watson, like sign up for those things that may not give you every country, every site, but then you do have to triangulate all of the data and try to come up with the best alternative based on what what information's out there, and try to pull in maybe obscure pieces. And so my advice would be, get a lot more sources than you might even think you need. Some are free, some are paid for, some are networking, some are doing your own research, and then try to triangulate and come up with the best package. The other thing is, I would also do some kind of polling of the local employees, not necessarily going out, because you can't just say, hey, do you think you're paid great? Hey, do you like your benefits? What do you want? But trying to ask good kind of pointed questions and get some benchmark data as well. Depending on the industry, some things are more common than others. If you've got more like tech or boutique industries, you might find some more perks you don't see, maybe more in manufacturing or operations. But I would try to include employee feedback if it made sense and you could get some information in a way in which wasn't sort of setting you up for opening Pandora's box as well. Because if you ask people what they want, they usually will tell you, and maybe you could afford it or not. But that would be my advice. Just get a ton of different resources.
I don't think there's anybody selling it as a service, not that I'm aware of. I don't know if Charlie, you've come across anyone, but maybe it's just too niche.
Yeah, there's a few that are starting to come out, which, Tash, we could look at together. They do a lot more of like open sourcing web crawling, which you'll notice out in the world, a lot of people don't advertise the salaries. They want to have that conversation. So you got to take it with a certain level of, and to Becky's point, there's a lot of research you can do between talking to the local employer of records and speaking to local recruitment firms. Like there's a lot of local knowledge that you can take pull together. It always comes down to what's the level of cost associated with, because there are big firms out there like Bloomberg and stuff like that that do full salary dossiers, benchmarking almost to the nth degree where it's too much. There's some that do a bit lighter. So there are out there. There are not that many though, as Matt said. And so it's, it's open source. It's looking at this, it's looking at that. So it's taking it, but then equating it to your particular situation. You can't take it as, the almighty word type thing. So, but it's an ongoing challenge, that's for sure.
On that, obviously, we provide benchmarking services, and the way we do it is, we also subscribe, pay a lot of money to some of the larger sort of firms to give us that sort of base data. And I know Emma's company there has helped us in the past. So we pull that data there. We also got a huge sort of database of our existing customers. So we're able to pull similar size organizations, locations, and then of course we work with our local recruiters. So just like what Becky says, you're pulling this information from different sources, but you really have to do your homework. And when we provide that service to our customers, it's not cheap, but if you want to do it and align it, because you don't want to be comparing yourself with, Google or Apple if you're not in that sort of, so you have to, it has to come back down to, you have to compare apples with apples. Well, after I just said Google, probably shouldn't have said Apple, but you know what I mean. But that's how we do it. But also, it's not always about the insurance-based benefits anymore. There's so much benefits that are, policy driven. That we start sort of getting information on, and it's like anything. Sort of one startup business will offer free food, and then another one will offer, they've got slides, and it just sort of snowballs from there, and these trends sort of start to come up. So what we try and do is basically bring all that information together and just say, well, look, sort of if you're trying to attract these sort of young graduates, they don't care about pension schemes right now. They just want to care about, gym memberships, or they want to care about sort of, mental health support or financial planning and things like that. So we're just always looking for not necessarily the typical sort of insurance-based benefits.
I guess if you have that top level of benefit, I don't know whether it's, I think we've got Bulgaria that have like super long maternity, and it's all covered by national insurance, which is amazing. And unless you can offer similar stuff and afford to offer that everywhere else, then obviously you're going to have these differences across the regions, and that's fine. I think that's okay, because I think, Natasha, that's what you said. Like, how do we make sure we offer the right, like, equivalent or equitable benefits? And I think it's just going to be that different, because each country will offer something different through, especially in Europe compared to US, etc. Right? You're going to have these massive differences. And we have been struggling with this as well. And it does show where our American colleagues look at our UK colleagues and look at our time off. And it's a bit, there is that statutory 28 days here, and there's that very generous 20 days there, right? It's a big difference. But that's, at least it was 20 days when my company was offering it in the US. But again, you're going to have to try to compare and see what's important in each country. I think that's really, it's about equivalent package. So it has to be equivalently, I don't know what's the word, but like, it has to be just as good, but it will be localized, right? So it's going to be different in each country.
That's the thing to also keep in mind on Kash's point, is that not every benefit will be available in every country.
Yeah.
So certain benefits even across Europe are just not available for you to either purchase or offer.
Or appreciated.
No, definitely not appreciated.
So this is what I've learned in Germany, and that was done through ignorance. It was before I even joined my organization. They've started offering this reimbursement. We had only a few people there, and this reimbursement for private medical insurance. And then we kind of grew that team a little bit more and realized that actually, like, we started talking to brokers, and they said, well, it's not really, like, most people are very happy in Germany with this national insurance. They still need to do some level of copay. And it's only if you're really, really above certain threshold, then you pay some of the private insurance if you want to. But again, 90% of people choose not to do that. And we just started thinking, okay, so we were so insisting to provide this like private medical insurance to people there, and they don't actually really need that. But what they do want, for instance, is much higher pension, like much higher pension contributions. So it's kind of more about, rather trying to give exactly the same stuff to everybody, it's more about that kind of equivalence of just as good a package, it will be different. And obviously communicate to people that it will be different, right? Because people talk if you've got global teams. And I'm not saying my company nailed it down yet, because there's still things that we struggle with, but yeah, I think that's...
How do you source this information? I mean, how do you make the decision as you're moving into that country of, okay, where should I be offering? Am I too far, too high, too low, etc.? Definitely, as Chris was saying, use the information that's coming to you from providers. They can be even competing EOR providers, bearing in mind they're partisan, obviously, but you grab the information from here, from there, and put it all together. And then, as Becky says, it's the synthesis of all of that that'll give you your lead. But unfortunately, probably not with a bow on it. Have to work on it a bit.
Involving the employees in some part of the process, again, where it makes sense and where it's not going to end up causing you more problems. But I think that's where it's good to get the feedback. I would say the challenge is, and this happened to us, you'd make an offer to a candidate in a new country and they'd say, well, where's this? And you, what do you mean? Oh, well, this is standard in this country. And it makes you feel like you're underprepared. You are underprepared. And, you can always go back. Oh, okay, we'll take a look at that. But when employees are asking for something, especially at the point of offer, and you are not aware that that's something important to that country, that, that's not a great feeling. I think you can recover from it. And we certainly did. But just trying to be more prepared on the front end, and employer records, I mean, they can really, really help with that.
I'm hoping for a workflow cheat sheet. So you simply go, oh, we want to go here or here. take me this path. What do I need to know? Here's your like do's and don'ts. Gonna
Yeah, there you
operating
go.
workflow, and I'll pay big money for that.
Yeah, we don't need the round table. We'll just handle your spread, your you know, your sheet, and that'll be it, right?
There you go, secret sauce.
Seriously, if we
Secret
all
sauce.
gather together, we can make this
Yeah.
and make a lot of money.
I don't think there's a flow chart, but there's definitely a methodology. And I think Chris is going to send this around afterwards. But there's definitely a way that you can approach it, which is not quite a flow chart, but it'll help, I think.
Yeah, we debated actually going through it on here, but it was just too much detail. So we're going to send it around afterwards. So you'll get a copy. It's already done.
I'm half kidding, but half dead serious in that this is hugely helpful. But
I'm with you.
Yeah, no,
it's board game. Like tricks along the way.
I mean, it might. We'll review all of this in the you know, everything we've talked about, the content of the discussion. But I think there's a very likely spin-off conversation around this, and maybe the decision tree, and going into more depth on Becky's point. Just listening, you know, I think there's probably some point around the reward side specific to EOR. There's points around visas and EORs. There's all kind of things that kind of go into more detail that we can do on separate sessions, which we very much will do. So yeah, we'll send it across to you, Liz, and you know, maybe on the next one we actually will go through it. We'll figure that out.
You probably have a 4-week class on just this though, so
like an EOR training school. Not a bad idea, actually. Has anyone else got anything to comment?
It was just one thing I wanted to, and it was to do with an acquisition, and it came up last year, and we never got to the bottom of it. And what that was we were helping a customer with a potential acquisition, and they had a number of international locations with their own entities. And they had a number that were through the EOR. And I know that when we went through the private equity went through the due diligence, that was one of those things that flagged as a, not a red flag, but it was something that they needed to delve deeper. And I just I wanted to know whether anybody had experience with, you know, a business being bought that had There you go, Matt.
Yeah, depends on the countries. And this is, I'll do the super brief version of this. Employer of record as a concept in many countries exists in a legal grey area. And when you apply New York's finest lawyers to a grey area, you have a fundamental incompatibility. It cannot. And so they are going to do what lawyers do best, which is to spend lots of time and money researching it. And they won't find a clear-cut answer. In some countries, they may find a clear-cut no, but those are fewer and further between now. But the fact is that they are going to be raising these as red flags purely because they don't fit neatly into a box.
You're not against it, yeah.
Yeah, no, that it was just one of obviously we were doing it from a HR compliance perspective, and then when that came across, there's all the sort of back office sort of chit chat. In the end, the acquirer withdrew, not because of that, but it was just something I thought, well, you know, obviously it's such a popular mechanism now. We recommend it for our customers going into new locations. They need somebody on the payroll quickly. So it's just one of those things that, you know, if any of you are thinking about exiting, it's just one of those items that could end up being not a deal breaker, but they could, as Matt says, there's extra work that's for sure going to need in explaining and reassuring the acquirer.
Yeah, definitely. Have a quick look. Have a look at the countries. See where it is, how problematic it is. It's the type of thing that, you know, there are a few consultants out there who work on this type of stuff, myself included. Cheap plug. We can actually look at that and look at reassuring let's call it private equity for argument's sake, about, you know, how this works in this particular place and what the actual practical ground looks like.
Yeah, it also comes down to the type of acquisition itself, whether it's an asset acquisition versus full taxable entity acquisition. All those kind of weigh all that in. And yeah, there's definitely understanding it and having a deeper context. To Matt's point, lawyers will spend a lot of money researching it and never come to a conclusion. So
I feel like I've been very mean to lawyers on today's call. I have a massive amount of respect for them, but you know that it is its own thing, which then needs to be taken with with all due care.
Matt, actually, you've led me nicely onto one of the points to wrap up now, because I know we're coming to time. We are offering some free one-to-one conversations if there's anyone that does have a specific question, if you're part of HRConnect relating to employer of records or legal entity setup and anything that we've talked about today with Matt. So just wanted to mention that. Also, just a quick mention, I know a couple of you on here today are going through the HR Continued Education or HRCI certification. So we'll, you know, and there's a number of other people joining some of the future roundtables that are also going through the certification, because credits are attributed through these roundtables. So we'll send some information separately to all of you guys, just specifically on HRCI, if you're not aware of what it is and why you might want to certify. So I just wanted to mention that briefly. And finally, one-to-one follow-up. So all of you guys on all of the roundtables will be offering, you don't have to take them, but we'll be offering a different kind of follow-up in terms of just trying to understand, first of all, your feedback on the sessions. We want you guys to be very much part of how we shape the following sessions. As I said, this is a new series that we're running, so would love your feedback, of course.